Hi lovelies! In this video, I'm going to show you how you can make your own passport case. Let's get started. Alright, so let's talk what materials you're going to need for this project. First and foremost, of course, some leather or some cork leather, essentially a fabric of your choice that is a little bit thicker. And the leather that I'm going to be using is a cowhide, and it's a 1.1 millimeters thick. Try to avoid too thick or too hard of leather, simply because the case might not close properly at the end, and also it might force you to bend your passport a lot, which over time you just don't want to do. You're gonna need some thread. I'm using a matching color, but you can of course also use an accent color, and then choose whether you're gonna sew this by machine or by hand. You will also need some scissors or cutting tools, and a measuring tape or a ruler depending on what your preferences are. For my passport case, I wanted to create a bit of like an ethnic look. However, I didn't have stamping tools. If you have them, fantastic, use them, create some beautiful designs with them. But what I used was letters. I have stamping letters that essentially I use to personalize bags, etc. And I created some interesting shapes with that. If you want to do the same, you will need some kind of stamping tools and a mallet. Depending on your preferences, you can also use some glue or double-sided tape or even clips to make the sewing part a little bit easier. Now that we have all the materials, let's get into measuring and cutting. Get your piece of fabric or leather, whatever you're using, and cut out one part that is 21.5 centimeters by 15 centimeters, and then two sets of 5 centimeters by 15 centimeters. If you've decided that you wanted to add a logo or that you wanted to add a design with stamping tools, this would be the right time to do it. Here you can see a couple of images of my progress. There was a lot of hammering involved, and as I mentioned before, I didn't have stamping tools, so I used letters, simple letters that I had. And so I used a piece of scrap leather and tested out a couple of shapes. You can see on the very left, I used like the W, the I, the V, because these are kind of ethnic looking. They could be made into zigzags or just straight lines. And yeah, I ended up using those interchangeably. So one line had one letter, and then the following line would have a different letter. And yeah, up until the very end. So you could just play around and be a bit creative of how you want your design to look. Once you're happy with the design, we can then go into assembling the passport case. You're gonna take the main leather piece and put it down in such a way that you're looking at the wrong side of the leather. Some leathers, there is no wrong side, but typically it is the one that is a little bit more fluffy and less slick. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna take the two sides, the two smaller pieces that we cut, and glue them or tape them or clip them, depending on the method you've decided to use, to the edges, as I'm showing you here in the images. And make sure that when you're sewing, that's the next step, that you only sew along the border. Do not sew in the inside, because if you do that, you won't be able to put your passport in. Now that everything is assembled, we're ready to go to our sewing machine and start sewing. As shown before in the image, make sure that you only sew around the borders. So start at the where the two leather pieces meet and go all around the corners. Sewing corners can be a little bit tricky. The best way to deal with that is to leave the needle inside of the fabric. Lift the foot, the presser foot, and then turn it around. When you're leaving the needle in, you need to pay attention at the position where you're leaving it in. When the motion of the needle goes up and down, when it goes down at sort of the midpoint, there's like a rotation underneath that happens, and at that moment the needle and the thread of the top part sort of loops around the bottom part, and with that is how you're creating an actual stitch. So when you're leaving the needle inside of the fabric, you need to make sure that it has already created that loop. It means that you need to leave the needle in at the moment where it is coming back out, more towards the end of it. And why I'm mentioning this is sometimes what has happened to me is that the corner doesn't get stitched properly and you get some sort of like diagonal stitch. So essentially the corner stitch is skipped. And this is because the loop wasn't properly built. That meant that in those scenarios I would have had my needle in the wrong position. Another thing that might be happening to you is that the last stitch in the corner, the position of it is not where you want it to be. So it's whether too far out, sort of reaching the edge, or not close enough to the edge, making the whole sewing look uneven. Now this is a bit of a hack. I use sometimes the reverse function. You might have seen it already here in this footage. But essentially I use the reverse function to sort of like shorten the stitch length. Once you have finished with all the sewing, make sure that you trim all the loose threads. And if you're using whether a nylon thread or a wax thread, you can also use a lighter like I am to sort of like burn into place. What you do is you're slightly melting the material, and with that it kind of helps keep the stitch in place. The last part depends a bit on the fabric that you have used. If you've used leather that is a bit rougher on the edges, you might want to cut and trim as well the leather, making sure that it's all nice and even, and burnish it. But that's also of course a bit up to you. You can burnish it, you can paint the edges, or just leave them raw depending on your taste. And here you go, here's the finished product. You can see here against the light, you can see it really nice and clear how the motif sort of turned out. And yeah, and on the inside it's just, you can just put in your passport like this, and that's it. On the back it's just plain. It really feels absolutely smooth, so make sure when you're choosing your leather that it's one that you really like touching. And yeah, the edges just got a bit cleaned, some burnishing. I hope this tutorial was useful to you and that you have now a brand new passport case. I would absolutely love to see your own creations, so make sure to tag me on Instagram at Tanya Rosas Designs. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss any new tutorials. See you soon, bye!